Hi there, and welcome to the latest episode of Off the Data Provided an Interpersonal Communication Podcast. I'm, of course, your host, Dr. Marcus C. Shepard. On today's episode, we are going to focus in on the launching of children / post-launching of children in the family life cycle. I've received a few emails over the past few weeks from students who are graduating. Round of applause for that. And them asking for advice about how to maneuver their changing relationships with their parents. So I thought I would just dedicate this episode to providing just some frameworks around how to maneuver your changing relationships with your parents as you are moving further into adulthood. I know myself, I have had to do this with my parents as well, and I am a stone's throw away from milestone birthday, right? I've been a tenured professor for quite a bit. I've had my PhD for 10 years, so we can add all of that up. And along the way of these milestones in my own life, as well as milestones in my parents' life, it's always going to be important to reevaluate and come together to discuss. So we're going to spend that time today talking about that in greater detail. Because I'm kind of merging a bunch of Ask Dr. Shepards for today's discussion, I am not going to delve into one today, but if you do have an Ask Dr. Shepard, feel free to email me at offthedataprovided@gmail.com. Once again, that is offthedataprovided@gmail.com, and we will delve into that on the next episode. So with that said, as I previewed in our introduction, we're going to spend time just musing around the family life cycle, around launching of children, as well as the post-launching of children, and how to renegotiate your relationship with your parents. Or if you're a parent listening and you have children going through these milestone changes, how to hopefully renegotiate your relationship with them so that they feel supported, but that you're also fostering and building on your relationship. So I referenced the family life cycle. We've talked about it before on the podcast, but we are going to review it rather quickly. So the traditional life cycle of a family begins with the first step, establishing a family, where a couple comes together, they settle into marriage or cohabitation. Then the second is enlarging. A family usually has a major change as a child or children are added. I've also argued with my students in my interpersonal communication class that we might also envision enlarging a family to include having pets. Maybe a dog or a cat. You get one together as a couple because there is an additional layer of responsibility. Then we have developing a family, where families spend a great deal of time together. Thoughts and energies of the parents are spent mostly on raising those children. Then, of course, we have encouraging independence, where children seek a greater autonomy for their families. That is, of course, stage 4. Stage 5, where we'll focus some of our attention, is launching children. So this is a vital change in most families. It happens when the last child leaves home to go to college, marry, or live on their own. And then, of course, the other aspect, stage 6, that we'll focus on, post-launching of children, happens after the departure of the children from the home and the spouses have to redefine their marriage. Additionally, I think this is also where the children should redefine how their relationship works with their parents in a sense. And we'll delve into that, of course, today as well. And then lastly, stage 7, retirement, brings about further change in a family life because it can be either positive or negative. So that, in a nutshell, maybe a minute speed round, maybe a minute and a half, who knows, is what the family life cycle looks like. And so a lot of the emails I've received over the past few weeks, of course, are from my current students, or maybe now former, right? The semester's over. Almost everybody passed, round of applause for that. So former students of mine. And when they're asking for advice, it's really how to reorient their relationship. They feel as if they are grown adults, and I would argue that they are for the most part. And they want to be able to foster a relationship with their parents where their parents are not treating them like a child, aka not seeing them as somewhat of an equal. And so, of course, when we think about parents, and I know I've had discussions with my own parents about this, when it comes to this launching of children in the post-launch period, and this happens frequently, it's going to be important to have a reorienting conversation with the individuals involved to figure out what the desires are, what the maybe non-negotiables are, what the negotiables are, and also what the requests are going to be. What oftentimes happens with interpersonal communication, and I think we're all guilty of this to a point, is we make these assumptions. We just assume someone understands, or we assume someone knows, or we expect them to pick up on these nonverbal hints or clues. But as we've talked about on this podcast before, nonverbal communication can be severely misread. So what we want to do is remove the assumptions and just have a conversation and talk to your parents about what you want, what you need, what you ideally would want the relationship to look like. And of course, that boundary resetting conversation, as I formally call it, can be difficult at first, but once you get the hang of it, it actually helps your relationship. I think about my own relationship with both of my parents, and we have become so close, specifically after I had the boundary resetting conversation with them. So I remember my boundary resetting conversation with them happened in 2019. So we are looking at almost 7 years since then. And that conversation really allowed us to scaffold and grow and mature in our relationships, where, of course, I will never see myself as a full equal to my parents, nor do I think they would ever see me as a full equal to them. But they do treat me a lot differently than they treated me back then, even a few years after that, right? Because we scaffolded the relationship and we set in these boundaries, we set in these expectations and ways to talk to each other. When conflict does arise, it's a lot easier to deal with. So a perfect example of a somewhat recent conflict that arose, my dad needed me to do something for him. He was out of town and he wanted me to do it immediately, right? I said I understood that and I was going to get it accomplished by the end of the day. And I understood that if he was here, he would do it as ABC. But because he's not here and I had other plans, other priorities, I was going to do it MNO, right? And so I shared with him, I said, I think we're both frustrated. You're frustrated because if you were here, you wouldn't ask me to do it and you would do it how you wanted it to be done. No problems. It would be executed perfectly in your mind. And I said, I'm frustrated because you asked me to do this. I already have concrete plans to do something. I am not able to change those plans, but I can try and maneuver and fit in what you want me to do. Now, it's going to be taxing because now I'm going to have to do what you asked me to do after my plans, when after my plans, I was originally intending to go home, relax, go to sleep. So my day ended up being longer. So, of course, I was frustrated with that, but I recognize that in our communication. Therefore, when it seemed tense for a moment, I sent a message that basically said what I just explained to you, and the tension immediately left. We both were able to recognize the frustrations from both person's point of view, recognize the sacrifices that I was making, as well as, former sacrifices that he has made. And we ultimately were able to work through that. And I doubt my father even remembers what the issue was, right? I'm not going into great detail about it because, of course, I haven't asked him if I could, and I try and respect people's privacy for the most part. But in essence, because we had the original boundary resetting conversation back in 2019, when that issue arose back in 2024, I was able to maneuver it in a way that didn't make me super frustrated, that didn't super frustrate him, and our relationship is stronger for it, right? We're currently planning a trip to Japan, a destination I've always wanted to go to. And I would say part of our closeness really does stem from that 2019 boundary resetting conversation. So I've talked around what the boundary resetting conversation is and how it got me to a great space with my father, of course, my mother as well. But what it really looked like was sitting down and saying, hey, nobody has ever given you a manual of how to be parents, right? Nobody also has ever given me a manual about how to be a child. We are assigned these roles and we have to figure out what they look like. Of course, there are some institutions that scaffold what that's supposed to look like. Department of Family Services, I think about. If you're not being a great caregiver or parent, then they might step in and remove the child from that situation. So there are some general expectations of what a parent is supposed to do: provide shelter, provide food, provide an education, hopefully provide a safe space. But what that looks like is different in different households. As we've talked about before on the podcast, but just a brief reminder, right? Communication patterns differ in households. So we know communication patterns and interpersonal communication consist of conversation orientation, so how open or closed communication is in the household, as well as on another axis, conformity orientation, so the extent to which family members are expected to adhere to family hierarchies or conform to their beliefs. So of course we have consensual families, which has high conversation, high conformity, which essentially means communication tends to have substantial depth and breadth. Parents encourage children to express their ideas and feelings, yet parents expect and encourage children to adhere to their values and beliefs. That was the household I grew up in. I was able to speak my mind within reason, of course, but I still was expected to follow what my parents said. I lived under their roof. It was their kind of show. Then you have pluralistic. So this is high conversation, yet low conformity. So communication is open. All family members are encouraged to express their thoughts and feelings, but you're not required or compelled to agree with the family. And so I would argue that my family dynamic with my parents have shifted more so to pluralistic, due in part to this conversation that we had, the boundary resetting conversation. And we're going to get to the nuts and bolts of that after I finish this. I promise. Then we have protective communication patterns. And this is low conversation, yet high conformity. So conflict is avoided. Children are expected to adhere to their parents' values, beliefs, decisions, which may undermine, of course, open and honest communication between parents and children. So children, in essence, are seen, not heard, yet you are supposed to do what the parents want you to do. And then, of course, laissez faire is low conversation and low conformity. There's usually limited connection between the members of the family. Parents and children have limited interactions, and therefore the children have a lot of independence. So as I shared, right, the communication patterns in my family were consensual, I would argue, from my personal experience, where we had high conversation. We were able to talk. We were able to express our feelings, but there was this high conformity standard where I still, at the end of the day, even if I didn't agree with it, I need to go along with it. Now, as a fully formed, realized adult, we have shifted into pluralistic. So we have high communication, conversation, right? Communication is open. We're encouraged to express our thoughts, our feelings, but are not required or compelled to agree with them. And so how did we make that switch? How did we get there? Of course, as I've been previewing for the last few minutes, it was this reorienting conversation. In essence, as I shared before, I began it with giving grace to them as well as giving grace to myself. We were given these roles. Of course, my parents created the roles. They chose to have a child, me, and they chose to be parents. So they took that mantle on. But parenting looks different for different people. We even hear all the time from people who come from multi-children households, how sometimes the older children feel as if they were parented, quote unquote, harder than the younger children. In essence, parenting looks different, nor should any two children be parented the exact same, I would argue. And of course, people may be looking at me, someone who doesn't have kids. I'm coming at it as an interpersonal communication expert. If we know, for instance, as we have talked about through the duration of this podcast, that communication is communicator, conflict, it's about the communicator specific. It's about context, content, and conflict. In essence, no two ways that you communicate with someone will be the same. And as I have shared before, how I approach one of my best friends, it's straight no chaser, versus another best friend, we have to woo-woo, ease into it. If I treat the straight no chaser friend as a woo 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 ease in, as I've shared before, Dr. Anderson Janine does not appreciate that. Just let's get down to brass tacks. Where Jaime, right, my primo, he doesn't like straight no chaser. He feels very abrasive by it. He wants to ease into it. And so let's say in theory, if I'm parenting, am I going to be straight no chaser with both kids? I can. That's within my right. But am I going to get the best outcome? So I say all of that to say that clearly I gave grace to them because there was no manual. Of course, there are countless books written that can provide insight and guides, but those books don't necessarily apply to every single child, or every method doesn't work for every single child. So some of the things that they tried on me maybe weren't the best. I know having the reorienting conversation with my mother around the issues of anti-fatness that appeared in our household and how debilitating that was for me, but giving her grace because she also experienced those things in her own household. So she was dealing with those things as a young woman, then a woman with a child that then became a fat child, and tried to help me maybe manage it or maneuver it or try and protect me from some of the vitriol and anti-fatness that maybe she experienced. That's maybe where she was coming from. But being able to talk that through, I was able to give her grace. Hopefully she gave me grace. I would argue she definitely did because we're super close. And we were able to foster a stronger relationship to be more so peers. As I've said before, right, we're not ideally peers. They're still my parents, but there's a level of respect that they show me that isn't necessarily the respect they show a child. I feel more as an equal, even though I'm not. And then for my father, right, we had our orienting conversation, of course, giving him grace, but also setting some boundaries and rules and saying, hey, I understand why you do this stuff or why you do this stuff, but it's not okay. One thing I'll share, because we kind of laugh about it, is the thermostat. So whenever my dad would come to my house, he would just go to the thermostat and do what he wanted. I say, hey, that's not cool, right? When I come to your house, I don't get to do that. Or if I do that, I'm kind of reprimanded, or you didn't ask me. So why is it okay for you to do that at my house, but it's not okay for me to do it at your house? And we had a conversation that, okay, cool. So what we do now is we just ask. And 9 times out of 10, I'm fine with turning up the thermostat, right? I like a room really cold. They don't necessarily. So I have no problem with that. Or I make sure I provide blankets, or in the wintertime, I make sure I have space heaters out because I don't want to be running up the gas bill. Everybody knows these bills are too damn high, right? So we had a good conversation. Of course, there was more nuance, there was more detail to that, but we went back and forth. My dad shared some things with me as well in that conversation about, well, why he does these things or how he approaches these things and his mindset behind it. And so we were able to have a more beneficial conversation where I got to know more about who he is as an individual, as a person, and not just seeing him in the light of my father. I think one of the main issues that we oftentimes have is we are stuck in these roles and we see ourselves only in these roles. And so we don't provide grace to other people. So in these boundary resetting conversations, I saw my parents as clearly my parent, but I also saw them as children themselves, young adults trying to maneuver. I saw them as spouses. I saw them as a parent to another child, right? My biological brother. I saw them as, a brother to my dad has multiple sisters, right? My mother is the only child, right? But has very close girlfriends. And, one of her best friends, we always joke, your friend blank, I won't say his name, right? But we had a really great conversation that allowed me to see more of who they were, more of the totality of who they were. And I think, unfortunately, as children, and maybe even as young adults, we really view our parents through the sole lens of being a parent. And we don't allow them grace and see the totality of who they are. So sure, a parent is who they were to you the majority of the time, but they exist in all of these other boxes. And a lot of these other boxes also inform who they are. So to have that boundary resetting conversation, first you need to identify why you want to have it. And so for me, I said, hey, we're moving into new chapters in our lives. I want to make sure that we continue to grow these relationships. Because what I have also seen happen, and I've experienced it in my own personal life as well, is sometimes these relationships don't grow and they're stuttered and they're hindered because we're still trying to operate in a confine that doesn't support who we are anymore. So if my parents were still trying to treat me as the 17-year-old that was living with them who was on his way to figuring out where he wanted to go to college, as now 37-year-old, right, 20 years later, they were still treating me in that paradigm, our relationship probably would be almost non-existent because they would be trying to quote unquote parent me too hard or tell me what to do. What our relationship looks like now, 20 years removed from that moment, is it's more so me coming for advice. I remember my dad would get frustrated sometimes, and this was also a great part of the boundary resetting conversation where he'd say, hey, you come to me and you ask for advice, and then you do something else. I'm like, well, why did I just spend an hour or 2 hours with you on the phone if you're just going to do something else? I said, hey, no, hey, hold on, wait, listen. I came to you because I respect and value your opinion. I also realize that you've lived life longer than me. You've seen things that I haven't seen. And so I'm coming to you for counsel because I really respect your opinion and the life that you've built. So I am taking what you say under advisement, but ultimately I have to live with the decision. I have to pull the quote unquote metaphorical trigger. Therefore, while I value your advice and I'm taking it under advisement and I'm strongly considering it, sometimes I'm going to do something different. And maybe the result is what you said it was going to be. But now I've learned that lesson. Or more times than not, it happens to turn out in a different way. And I got to where I wanted to go, maybe not the way you thought I should get there. So that type of boundary resetting conversation, right? As I said, we started it off with saying, hey, we're at a milestone change, right? We're at a shift in our larger family group dynamic. We're adding new hats. So let's address the hats that we've had and figure out where we want these hats to go. And so I joke with people, but it's true. My parents are my little friends. Whenever I have functions and they're in town, they're always invited. 9 times out of 10, they show up and they hang out with me and my friends, just like one of the crew. I am one of their little friends. As you know, TV shows joke, I'm not one of your little friends. Well, I actually am one of their little friends now, and they're one of my little friends. But we got there because we were able to scaffold with this conversation. So as I said, I first identified that hey, we have a shift, we're adding hats, let's readdress what these hats look like. Then during that conversation, we set some boundaries. We set some expectations. We talked through those boundaries. We talked through those expectations. We provided hypotheticals. Well, what if this happens? What if that happens? What if this? And we talked through it. And through that, I got to see them, as I shared before, in a different light that allowed me to better understand who they were as people, what they tried to do. Some of it worked exceptionally well, I would argue. Some of it maybe not so well. But giving them grace, but also being able to share my frustrations as a grown adult and say, hey, you did these things. I'm not blaming you or saying that you could have done better, because sitting on this other side of adulthood, I realized that you were trying to figure it out at the same time. You might have just been 2 pages ahead in the book of life than me at that point, but you were trying to do your best with what you had. So we were able to talk through those things, hurts, traumas, slights, and move forward. And then as I shared, when an issue arises, we're able to hop back in that type of conversation where there is a baseline level of respect, of love and understanding, and realizing that we want to work through whatever this issue is, whether it's a minor conflict issue of where we're going to eat. I don't eat indoors, right? Or if it is going to be something larger. So for my former students who are struggling with this, right? They have now graduated. They might be moving out of their parents' households, or, unfortunately, due to the economy and the way it is, you might still be living in their household, but you want more freedom. You want more independence because you are a quote unquote adult. It's going to be important to sit down and say, hey, I understand I'm still under your roof and you have rules for your roof and how you like things to go. And I respect that. I also am asking that you and I can come together and figure out a scaffolding and an arrangement to slowly but surely provide more independence for me, provide more equity in this relationship. Because what happens with parents is, and they're guilty of this, my parents have said this to me from time to time, not recently, right? Maybe because I have a full beard and my mother, accused me of dyeing my beard, even though I don't dye my hair. I just don't live a stress-free life. If my students can attest, I'm usually very bubbly, as you can hear on the podcast. So we, always will see me as her little boy, right? My lock screen is a childhood photo. And my mom has, from time to time, has been like, I still see you as that little boy. Great. But if you still treated me like that little boy at 37, we would probably not have a great relationship, because that's not what I'm looking for. And as we've shared before, this is their first time doing this. Even if even if you have older siblings and they've tried to maneuver that with them, you're different than your siblings. So what you need or what you want might be different. Maybe your older siblings don't care to have that much of a relationship with your parents anymore. That's cool, but maybe you do. And so this conversation and conversations that will spur from it are going to be really helpful. And I'll say that this conversation for me really birthed from conversations that I've had with Dr. Anderson, right? Janine, my best friend, right? One of my best friends, my sister, my older sister, as I essentially call her, where we have boundary resetting conversations with each other basically once a year. And it's kind of natural. We just slide in, hey, how have I been showing up? How have I not been showing up? What do you need more from me? What do you need less from me? What have I been doing that's been hitting the mark? What have I been doing that maybe has been annoying you? So on and so forth. And because we've had these conversations now for almost a decade, it just is natural and it helps us evolve together. Because what we oftentimes see with relationships is sometimes we evolve apart. And the reasons we oftentimes evolve apart from people is because we just haven't had these types of conversations to orient us to identify conflicts or to set forth language or to set forth even space to have these conversations when you start feeling as if you're drifting from one another. Because we all are forever changing. Who I am today is not who I was 2 weeks ago, who I wasn't, 5 months ago, several years ago, decades ago. I'm not that person. And who I am today is not going to be who I'm going to be in a few weeks, in a few months, in a few years. But having the scaffolding and having that situated allows you then to maneuver these vast changes that happen in life. And so as my parents are clearly, in the retirement phase, right? It's a stage 7, and clearly planning for ... It's been really helpful for our relationships. I've been super transparent with them. They've been very transparent with me about things, about goals, about where I see life going, about where they see life going, about their desires. And as I've said before, we now exist in this pluralistic conversation communication pattern where clearly we're open with our communication, but the conformity is not high. It's low. So even we differ in terms of some ideologies politically. I have been called revolutionary brother by my mother since high school. High school was 2 decades ago for me, right? And so clearly my politics are a little different than theirs, but we have the space to discuss. And we have the space to respect one another. And we have the space to maneuver these challenging conversations, because at the core of them is love. At the core of them is respect. At the core of them is care. And when we can remind people of that, when you reach these tense moments of communication, you're able to maneuver them a lot better than if you hadn't set this groundwork foundation. And so when things get tense with them, we have a resetting conversation in a sense. As I shared with you when things were getting tense about 2 years ago with my father around a request that he had made, we had a conversation and it ameliorated the frustrations from both of us. I said, hey, I understand you're frustrated. And listen, you can hear I'm frustrated too. But ultimately, it's going to get done because I love and I care about you. It's just not going to get done in the way that you would want or the timeline you would want, but it's still going to get done before it needs to get done. And being able to have that freedom in that space to have that, as I shared, remove that frustration, right? That weight that was on us was lifted and we were able to work through it. And I'm sure my father doesn't even remember this time. So I say all of that to say, get in a space and a place to have that boundary resetting conversation. Start off with saying, hey, we're in a new space, new milestones are approaching. I want to make sure that we have scaffolded ourselves so that we can evolve with each other, so that we can maintain and or even get closer than we are now. And figure out what that through line looks like. Of course, the baseline is respect, is love and care, and recognizing that we can work through whatever conflict arises. As we've talked about before on this podcast, conflict oftentimes is viewed either as win-win, win-loss, or lose-lose. And so we're not looking at lose-lose, right? Where I'm compromising, you're compromising, but we ultimately aren't satisfied at all. Or you just get what you want because you're the parent, or I get what I want because I'm the child. Or ultimately, we're looking for that win-win. Let's find an alternate solution that we both feel happy about. And it's not always going to be win-win, but when we can reorient the conflict and say, hey, conflict is a position in a space where I can love you from, then you're going to have a better engagement with it than if you just view it as lose-lose. A lot of people view conflict as lose-lose, right? We're going to compromise and I'm not going to be happy and they're not going to be happy. Or I've compromised, hopefully they're happy so they won and I lost, but I'm going to win the next one. We don't want to view it as that. We want to view conflict as a space where we can love one another from, a creative space where we can figure out an alternate solution that neither of us had ideally thought of before. And having that boundary resetting conversation and having them when conflict arises and reminders will be helpful. Of course, when we first had the conversation in 2019, I brought the thermostat example up. A few months later, right, we had an issue and say, hey, don't you remember? And of course, it takes time for people to change. Change is not instant. Change is also not linear. So, of course, maybe he remembered, but then maybe a year later, he forgot for a moment and we joked about it. But we kept progressing forward and we kept moving forward. And that's what we're looking for with this boundary resetting conversation. How can we set ourselves up for success to move forward with each other as we evolve, as we change, as our needs, as our wants, as our desires also evolve and change? So that is what I would recommend for my students when you are dealing with this. It can be, of course, difficult to start the conversation, and maybe the first conversation doesn't go so well, but stick with it. Revisit that conversation in a few weeks. Also, in order to have a productive conversation, as I have with my parents, let's make sure those smartphones are away, those smartwatches are on silent, so we can be fully present. And request that, hey, can I get an hour of your time or 2 hours of your time? Let's put our phones in another room. Let's take our smartwatches off. Let's make sure that the TV is off, that we are solely focused on each other and what we're trying to say, that we are more present in this moment. Because as we've talked about throughout the entirety of this podcast, being present is something that is slowly but surely drifting and slipping away from everyone. I even know for my family, we used to be famous for always having dinner with each other. Phones were away. And in more recent times, right, I've been at dinner and phones are present, phones are out, people are on their phone while we're talking and stuff. So even we aren't as present as we used to be. But especially for this boundary resetting conversation, let's make sure that our phones are away, they're on silent, they're on do not disturb. And if something happens, as we've talked about before, rarely it ever does, because the excuse for having your phone is, well, what in case there's an emergency? How many times has there ever really been an emergency? Crickets, right? Usually it has not happened, or it is very rare. So set aside the 2 hours, remove the phones, set the intention that this is through love, this is through care, this is through respect, this is to scaffold us into the next iteration of what our family looks like. This is to make sure that we evolve together, that you can understand who I am as I'm growing and evolving, and I can better understand who you are because I've only seen you as a parent. Or on the flip side, if you're a parent, I've really only seen you as a child, and I'd like to see you more as a fully formed adult, and take it from there. So that, in a nutshell, is hopefully some helpful musings on how to have this boundary resetting conversation. As I shared before, if you do have any Ask Dr. Shepherds, as we're not going to do those today, feel free to email me at offthedataprovided@gmail.com. Once again, that is offthedataprovided@gmail.com. And if you have any questions or you're confused about anything that I've shared here today, also feel free to email me there. Other than that, I'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.